The first snow of 1855 fell on Whitetail County like a death sentence. Emma Sullivan watched it through the grimy glass of what used to be her general store, a place now as empty as her stomach. Each flake was a tiny white ghost, a promise of the starvation to come. Behind her, 5 children huddled on a single mattress on the floor, their breaths making small clouds in the freezing air. Mary, her oldest at 12, with eyes that had seen too much. Catherine, the quiet one. The twins, Elizabeth and Robert, barely 8 years old. And little Thomas, only 4. His small frame racked by a dry cough. 6 months. That's how long it had been. 6 months since the influenza came for her husband, Charles, taking him in a feverish week and leaving Emma with a mountain of debt and 5 hungry mouths. The neighbors who once tipped their hats now crossed the street, their eyes averted from the terrible spectacle of the Sullivan family's slow collapse. "Mama," Mary whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "We have to eat. Thomas is getting worse." Emma's hand instinctively went to the simple gold band on her finger. It was the last thing of value she owned, the last piece of Charles. Selling it felt like selling his memory, but the sound of Thomas's cough was a chisel chipping away at her resolve. She had to do something. She just didn't know what. A sharp, impatient knock on the door made them both jump. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was the sound of an ending. Outside stood Mr. Jensen from the bank. His face was pinched, his eyes small and cold like pebbles. He didn't bother with a greeting. "Your time is up, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his words slicing through the frigid air. "The store has been sold. The new owners want you and your brood out by sunset." The word brood hung in the air, ugly and demeaning. Emma felt a flash of heat in her chest. "But where will we go? It's winter." Jensen's smile was a thin, cruel line. "That, madam, is not the bank's concern." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the pale faces of the children peeking from behind their mother's skirts. He looked like a man calculating sums. "However," he continued, a new tone in his voice, "I might have a solution. One that could benefit everyone involved." He reached into his thick wool coat and pulled out something that made Emma's blood run cold. 6 squares of rough cardboard, with holes punched in the corners and pieces of coarse twine looped through them. "Folks around here are always in need of workers," Jensen explained, his voice smooth as oil. "And while strong backs don't come cheap, a desperate widow with 5 children, well, in the world of business, we call that dead weight. An opportunity for a savvy investor." He pushed the cardboard signs into her numb hands. Emma looked down. On each one, 2 words were scrawled in thick, black ink. "For sale." "You can't be serious," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. The world tilted on its axis, the ground seeming to fall away beneath her feet. "Oh, I'm perfectly serious," Jensen said, his smile widening. "Wear these in the town square tomorrow at noon. Stand on the auction platform. Someone might take the whole lot of you, though it's more likely they'll want the older ones. The boy has some muscle on him. The girls look trainable." He tipped his hat, the gesture a mockery of politeness. "It's better than freezing to death, wouldn't you say?" After he left, the heavy wooden door closing with a sound of finality, Emma sank to the floor. The signs felt like stones in her hands, pulling her down into a dark, bottomless pit. Mary knelt beside her, her small face a mask of disbelief and horror. "What are we going to do, Mama?" Emma looked at her sleeping children, their innocent faces peaceful in the dim light. She looked at the snow falling faster now, a white shroud blanketing the world. And she knew what she had to do. She had to swallow her pride. She had to swallow her dignity. She had to swallow her heart. "We'll do what we must," she said, her voice a stranger to her own ears. She picked up the first sign and began to thread the rough twine through the holes. "We will survive this." But as she tied the first knot, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was tying a noose. By noon the next day, the Sullivan family was a public spectacle. They sat on the cold, splintered wood of the auction platform in the center of the town square, the words "for sale" hanging around their necks like accusations. Emma held Thomas on her lap, his small body trembling against hers. The other 4 children were lined up beside her, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a terror that ripped Emma's soul to shreds. A crowd had gathered. Some pointed and whispered. Others stared with cold, calculating eyes, sizing up her children like livestock. Emma recognized the leering gaze of a man named Peters, a drunkard who ran a grimy boarding house. She saw the pinched face of Mrs. Gable, a woman known for working her servants to the bone for pennies. This wasn't a rescue. This was a feeding frenzy. Mr. Jensen stood before them, playing the part of the auctioneer. "Starting bid for the lot is $200, he called out, his voice booming across the square. "That covers the widow's debt and then some, or make an offer on individuals. The boy is small but will grow. The girls know cooking and sewing." "I'll give you 50 for the oldest girl," shouted Peters, his eyes fixed on Mary. "I need someone to keep my house in order." Mary flinched as if struck. Emma pulled her daughter closer, her arm a protective shield. 75 for the twins, countered Mrs. Gable. "They're a good age for training. I can make them useful." Catherine began to cry, silent tears tracking paths through the dirt on her cheeks. Robert, trying to be brave, balled his small hands into fists, his knuckles white. Emma knew what this really was. Labor contracts, Jensen had called them. A pretty lie to mask an ugly truth. This was the end of her family. Her children would be scattered to the winds, sold to the lowest bidder, and she might never see them again. The thought was a physical pain, a blade twisting in her gut. Just as her last sliver of hope was about to shatter, a horse whinnied at the edge of the crowd. The people parted, murmuring amongst themselves, as a lone rider approached. He was a tall man, sitting easy in his saddle despite a slight, noticeable limp. His clothes were worn but clean, his face weathered by the elements, and his eyes were the color of a gathering storm. He guided his horse to the platform and stopped, studying the Sullivan family for a long, silent moment. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. He dismounted slowly, his gaze never leaving Emma's. "How much for all of them?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that cut through the silence. Jensen's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The whole lot, Mr. Holt. Well, that would be the full 200. The man, Holt, ignored the banker. His focus was entirely on Emma. $150, he stated, not asked. "That covers their debt to your bank, doesn't it, Jensen?" "Well, yes, but—" "Then 150 it is." Holt reached into a leather pouch at his belt. He paused, his hand full of coins, and looked directly at Emma. "Unless Mrs. Sullivan objects." The question was a lifeline. He wasn't talking to Jensen, he was talking to her. He was giving her a choice, something no one had done in months. In this stranger's hard face, she saw something she hadn't expected to ever see again: respect. "What exactly are you buying, Mr. Holt?" she asked, her voice shaking but clear. "Labor," he answered simply. "Room and board. Nothing more, not ownership, never that." Emma looked at her children's terrified faces. She looked at the leering men and the cold women in the crowd, and then she looked back at this stranger who offered a sliver of hope in a world of despair. He was offering to keep them together, but what was his price? "What guarantee do I have," she pressed, "that you won't sell us off one by one the moment we're beyond the town limits?" A muscle twitched in Holt's jaw. "You have my word," he said, his voice low and steady. "As a man who also knows what it means to lose everything." His words struck a chord deep inside her. Was the word of a stranger enough? Could she gamble her children's future on a feeling? As she hesitated, Thomas, her sweet Thomas, tugged at her sleeve. He pointed a small, grubby finger at the tall man. "Mama," he whispered, his voice full of a child's unwavering certainty. "He has kind eyes, like Papa." And in that moment, the choice was made. As Holt counted out the coins into Jensen's greedy hand, Emma saw the banker catch the eye of a rough-looking man leaning against a post at the edge of the square. It was Rufus Cooper, a man with a reputation for trouble. Jensen gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. A small, triumphant smirk played on Cooper's lips. A cold dread washed over Emma. This wasn't just a transaction. It was something else entirely. She and her children were not the cargo. They were the bait. The wagon wheels groaned a mournful song as they left Whitetail County behind. Every rut in the trail, every jolt of the wagon, was a reminder of their new reality. They were no longer the Sullivan family, store owners. They were now the property of a stranger, a man named Daniel Holt, heading into an unknown wilderness. Emma sat on the driver's bench beside him, her back ramrod straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She held Thomas, who had finally cried himself to sleep. In the back, the other children huddled together amidst their meager possessions: a single trunk of clothes, Charles's old hunting rifle, and a worn family Bible. They traveled for nearly an hour in a tense, heavy silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the plodding of the horses. "Your husband," Daniel said finally, his voice startlingly rough. "Jensen mentioned influenza." "Charles," Emma replied, her voice tight. "He caught it helping a neighbor whose child was sick. The doctor said he'd never seen a fever take a man so fast." Daniel just nodded, his eyes on the trail ahead. "My Alice was the same. 3 years ago now." A shared grief hung between them, a fragile, unspoken connection. It wasn't comfort, not exactly, but it was something. "Your ranch," Emma ventured, needing to fill the silence with facts, with anything other than the swirling vortex of her fears. "Is it far?" "Another hour," he said. His hands, calloused and strong, tightened on the reins. "It's called the Broken Horn. 400 acres, but the drought's taken most of the good pasture. There's the main house, a cabin for you and the children, a barn. It's nothing fancy." "And what is it you expect from us?" The question burned in her throat. She had to know. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Work, Mrs. Sullivan. Honest work. The older ones can help with chores, feeding the chickens, mending fences. You can cook?" "I can." "Good. I haven't had a proper meal in months." He risked a sideways glance at her, his stormy eyes assessing her. "I'm not looking for a wife, if that's what you're worried about. I just need help running what's left of my ranch." The words should have been reassuring, but they felt cold, transactional. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. He had bought labor, just as he said. Catherine's small voice piped up from the wagon bed. "Do you have any horses, Mr. Holt?" A flicker of something, maybe a smile, touched Daniel's lips. "A few, and a half-wild Mustang nobody's been able to ride." "I could try," Robert said, his voice full of a boy's bravado. "Papa taught me." "Robert," Emma scolded gently, but Daniel chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "Maybe when you're bigger, son. For now, you'll learn safer things." They crested a hill, and the Broken Horn Ranch spread out below them. It was desolate. A weathered 2-story house stood against the vast, empty landscape. A smaller cabin nearby listed to one side, its porch sagging. The outbuildings were in various states of disrepair. It wasn't just a place that needed work. It was a place that felt heartbroken. "It ain't much," Daniel said, a hint of apology in his tone. "It's shelter," Emma replied, her voice flat. "It's a roof over my children's heads. That's enough." As they drew closer, she noticed strange details. The windows on the main house weren't just dirty. Some were boarded up from the inside. The gate to the main corral was splintered, as if something had tried to break out, or in. And there was a single, lonely grave under a large oak tree on a nearby hill. Alice's grave. The children scrambled from the wagon, their legs stiff. A scruffy dog came bounding from behind the barn, barking wildly. The children shrank back, but Daniel let out a sharp whistle. "Scout, enough!" The dog skidded to a halt, its tail wagging tentatively. "He's not used to company," Daniel said, unloading their trunk. "The cabin's over there. Been empty a while. Pump out back for water." Mary, ever practical, was already assessing their new home. "The windows need washing, And that step is loose. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You've got a foreman's eye, girl. The cabin was worse up close. The door creaked open to reveal a single dusty room. Cobwebs draped the corners like funeral shrouds. There were 2 narrow beds with bare, stained mattresses, a wobbly table, and a stone fireplace filled with old ashes. The air was thick with the smell of neglect and mice. This was their salvation. It felt more like a prison cell. Been empty since my last ranch hand left, Daniel said from the doorway, his large frame blocking the light. Left in a hurry. After he deposited their trunk and retreated to the main house, a heavy silence fell over the small cabin. Elizabeth started to cry. "Mama," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. "Why did he really buy us?" Emma had no answer. She looked around the squalid little room and thought of the nods she'd seen pass between Jensen and Cooper. Men didn't spend $150 on dead weight out of the kindness of their hearts. There was a reason they were here. A reason Daniel Holt needed them. And she had a terrifying feeling it had nothing to do with mending fences or cooking meals. That night, after a grim meal of jerky and biscuits Daniel had brought over, Emma tucked her children into the lumpy beds. Thomas wouldn't sleep until she promised 3 times that they would never have to wear the for sale signs again. Later, unable to sleep, Emma was startled by a noise at the window. A man's silhouette was framed against the moonlit sky. Her heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed Charles's rifle from the corner, the cold metal a familiar weight in her hands. It was Daniel. He saw her raise the rifle and backed away quickly, his hands held up in a gesture of surrender. "Just checking the shutters," he called out softly, his voice strained. "Storm's coming in." Emma lowered the rifle, her heart still pounding. A knock would have sufficed Mr. Holt. He hesitated, his face a mask of shadows. "You handle that weapon like you know how to use it." "My husband taught me." "Good," Daniel said, and his tone sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't reassuring. "Out here, everyone needs to be able to protect themselves." He glanced towards the sleeping children. "All of you should learn, even the boy." He started to leave, then turned back, his silhouette a dark, imposing shape. "One more thing, Mrs. Sullivan. There's a shotgun wrapped in oilcloth under the 3rd plank of your porch. If trouble comes, and you can't be sure who to trust, you use it." He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked back toward the dark, silent main house, his limp more pronounced in the moonlight. Emma stood frozen, the rifle clutched in her hands. The wind howled outside, sounding like a lonely scream. If trouble comes, and you can't be sure who to trust. He hadn't been warning her about strangers or bandits. He had been warning her about himself. The days at the Broken Horn Ranch settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Emma and the children worked from sunup to sundown. They scrubbed the cabin until it was clean, patched the leaky roof, and planted a small winter garden with seeds Daniel found in the back of the barn. Mary, with her quiet confidence, discovered a knack for handling the chickens, coaxing them to lay eggs when they hadn't for months. The twins, Robert and Elizabeth, followed Daniel everywhere, their initial fear replaced by a child's desperate need for a father figure. Even quiet Catherine seemed to find her place, tending to the small garden plot with a fierce devotion. But Daniel Holt remained an enigma. He was a man of contradictions. One moment, he would be patiently showing Robert how to whittle a piece of wood into a bird. The next, a dark mood would descend upon him, and he would retreat into a wall of silence, his eyes fixed on the grave under the oak tree. He rarely entered the main house's upstairs rooms, sleeping on a cot in the front parlor. He drank whiskey at night, alone on his porch, staring out into the oppressive darkness. Emma watched him, her unease growing. This wasn't just a man grieving his wife. This was a man haunted by something terrible. One afternoon, while cleaning out the last of the rubbish from their cabin, Mary made a discovery. Tucked away on a high shelf in the small closet, hidden beneath a pile of old rags, was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bluebird. It was worn smooth, as if held by anxious hands for many hours. On the bottom, A single, elegant letter, A, was burned into the wood. Alice's. "Look, Mama," Mary said, holding it out. "It's beautiful." Just then, Daniel appeared in the doorway, a bucket of water in his hand. He saw the bird in Mary's grasp, and his face went slack with shock, the color draining from his cheeks. For a second, he looked utterly terrified. He strode forward and snatched the bird from Mary's hand, his movements harsh and sudden. "Where did you find this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "On the shelf," Mary whispered, shrinking back from his anger. Daniel stared at the bird, his knuckles white. "It's nothing," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "Just an old trinket." He shoved it deep into his pocket and turned to leave, his jaw tight. "Forget you ever saw it." His reaction was far too extreme for an old trinket. It was the reaction of a man who had just seen a ghost. Why was something of his dead wife's hidden away in the cabin where his ranch hand used to live? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. That night, sleep wouldn't come for Emma. Daniel's violent reaction to the bird played over and over in her mind. Restless, she got up and paced the small cabin floor. As she crossed the room, her foot caught on a loose floorboard near the hearth. It had always been a little uneven, but tonight it shifted more than usual. Curiosity gnawed at her. She knelt down, her fingers finding the edge of the plank. It lifted easily. She had expected to see nothing but dirt and foundation stones. Instead, nestled in the dark space below, was a small, leather-bound book, a diary. Her hands trembling, she lifted it out. She lit a candle, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The handwriting inside was neat and feminine. She turned to the first page. Property of Alice Holt. Emma knew she shouldn't. It was a violation, a trespass into a dead woman's soul. But she couldn't stop herself. She had to understand the shadows that filled this ranch, the secrets that clung to Daniel like a second skin. She skipped through entries about weather and cattle prices, searching for something, anything, that would explain the darkness in this place. She found it in the final entry, dated just 3 days before Daniel had said Alice died. The ink was slightly smeared, as if by tears or rain. It read, "He knows. I told him everything, and I saw the look in his eyes. He is not the man I thought he was. I fear what Daniel will do when the Cooper boys arrive. I must get away before then." Emma's blood ran cold. He knows. I fear what Daniel will do. She snapped the diary shut, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The kind eyes Thomas saw were a lie. The man who had saved them from the auction block, the man who had given them shelter. Was he a monster? Was he a murderer? And the Cooper boys were coming. The very next morning they appeared on the horizon. 3 riders, moving with the slow, deliberate menace of circling vultures. Daniel saw them from the barn, and his face became a granite mask. "Take the children inside, Emma," he ordered, his voice dangerously low. He strode toward the main house, not for his gun, but for a heavy wood-splitting axe that leaned against the porch. "Bar the door, and no matter what you hear, you do not come out." Emma herded her frightened children into the cabin, her mind reeling from the words in the diary. She watched through a crack in the shutters as the 3 men dismounted. The leader, a big man with fiery red hair and a cruel smile, was Rufus Cooper. "Holt!" Cooper called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. "Just paying a neighborly visit. Heard you bought yourself some help. Smart move. No one to complain if you work 'em too hard." Daniel stood silently on the porch, the axe held loosely in one hand at his side. He didn't look like a rancher. He looked like an executioner. "My land isn't for sale, Cooper," Daniel said, his voice flat and dead. "Everything's for sale," Cooper sneered. His gaze drifted past Daniel, toward the cabin where Emma and the children were hiding. "Especially land with bad memories. Shame what happened to your Alice. A pretty thing like that, dying all alone out here in a storm." He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "Some folks say it wasn't the storm that got her." Emma saw Daniel's hand tighten on the axe handle, his knuckles turning white. He took a single, deliberate step forward. "You should leave," Daniel said, and the quietness of his voice was more terrifying than any shout. Cooper just laughed, a sound like gravel grinding together. "We'll be back, Holt. Sooner or later you'll get tired of living with ghosts, and when you do, we'll be here to take this place off your hands." They mounted their horses and rode away, their laughter echoing back on the cold wind. After they were gone, Daniel didn't move for a long time. He just stood there, staring at the empty horizon. Then, with a roar of pure anguish, he swung the axe, sinking it deep into one of the porch railings, splintering the old wood. That night, Emma couldn't bear the silence and the fear any longer. After the children were asleep, she walked to the main house, Alice's diary clutched in her hand like a shield. She found Daniel slumped at his kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. The carved bluebird sat on the table beside it. "They think you killed her," Emma said, her voice shaking. She placed the diary on the table between them. "This says you had a reason to." Daniel stared at the small book, his face pale in the lantern light. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. "Alice didn't die from influenza," he confessed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "And she didn't die in a storm." He took a long, ragged breath, the sound of a man breaking apart from the inside out. "She was my wife," he said, his gaze distant. "But she was in love with Rufus Cooper. I found out. I confronted her. We argued. She ran from me." His voice broke. "I killed her, Emma. I might as well have used my own 2 hands." The confession hung in the small, dark kitchen, more chilling than the wind howling outside. Emma had brought her children into the home of a killer. He hadn't bought them to be workers. He had bought them to be witnesses, to be a shield. He was hiding his crime behind the innocence of 5 small children, and she had led them straight into the monster's den. Daniel's story tumbled out, a torrent of grief and guilt that had been dammed up for 3 long years. He'd found letters from Rufus Cooper to Alice, full of secret meetings and plans to run away together. He'd confronted her on the night of the first big storm of the season. The argument had been terrible, full of accusations and heartbreak. In her anger and fear, Alice had run out of the house, screaming that she was going to Rufus, that she'd rather die than spend another night with Daniel. "I went after her," Daniel choked out, burying his face in his hands. "But the storm, it was a blizzard. I couldn't see. I couldn't find her. I searched all night. I found her the next morning, not far from the oak tree. She'd fallen. The doctor said she died of exposure, but I know the truth. I drove her out into that storm. My anger killed her." He had told no one about the affair. He'd let the town believe it was a tragic accident, burying the secret along with his wife, hoping to bury his guilt as well. The Cooper brothers, he explained, knew the truth. They had been tormenting him ever since, not for revenge, but because they knew his guilt made him weak. They thought they could break him, force him to sell the ranch he'd inherited, the ranch Alice had so desperately wanted to leave. Emma listened, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. The story fit. It explained the darkness in him, the haunted look in his eyes, the way he kept everyone at a distance. But was it the whole story? Alice's diary had said, "I fear what Daniel will do when the Cooper boys arrive." She hadn't mentioned Rufus. She'd mentioned all of them. And what about the ranch hand, Silas, the one who had left in such a hurry? "Your last ranch hand," Emma asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "When did he leave?" Daniel looked up, his eyes confused. "Silas. The night Alice. The night of the storm. He cleared out his things and was gone by morning. Couldn't face the grief of it all, I suppose." It was too much of a coincidence. A man doesn't just disappear into a blizzard the same night his employer's wife dies. He runs. But what was he running from? What had he seen? Over the next few days, a fragile, terrifying truce settled over the ranch. Emma kept her children close, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. Was Daniel a broken, grieving husband, or was he a cunning murderer who had crafted the perfect, tragic story? She didn't know which was worse. Mary, always watching, always listening, seemed to sense her mother's turmoil. While Daniel was out mending fences on the far pasture, she began her own quiet investigation. She talked to Scout, the old ranch dog, who seemed agitated whenever he got near the old, disused well behind the barn. She explored the barn itself, a place Daniel rarely went. It was Catherine, the quietest Sullivan, who made the next discovery. She was helping Mary gather eggs when she saw something glinting in the dirt floor of an empty horse stall. A stall Daniel had told them never to use. She dug at it with her small fingers and pulled out a tarnished silver locket. She brought it to Emma, her eyes wide. "Mama, look." Emma pried the delicate clasp open. On one side was a miniature portrait of a beautiful, smiling woman, Alice Holt. On the other side, Emma expected to see a portrait of Daniel, or perhaps Rufus Cooper. But it was neither. Staring back at her was the smug, pinched face of Mr. Jensen, the banker from Whitetail County. Emma felt the world lurch. This changed everything. She turned the locket over. On the back, almost worn away, was a tiny inscription: "To my dearest Alice. Forever yours, J." Alice Holt hadn't been having an affair with Rufus Cooper. She had been involved with the banker, the man who had forced Emma into the town square, the man who had sold her family to Daniel Holt. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a conspiracy. The Coopers weren't the predators. They were just dogs on a leash. And Mr. Jensen held the other end. But why? Why would a banker from town be so obsessed with this failing, drought-stricken ranch? The answer came from the most unlikely of sources. A piece of town gossip Mary had overheard during their one and only trip for supplies. She'd been lingering by the pot-bellied stove in the general store, pretending to warm her hands, and had heard two old ranchers talking. "Always said old man Holt found gold up on that property," one of them had mumbled. "Never told a soul where. Took the secret to his grave." Gold. It was always about gold. Jensen wasn't after the land for grazing. He was after what was under it. Alice must have been his way in. He'd seduced her, promising her a life away from the ranch, if only she could find the location of the old man's strike, but she must have failed. And when Daniel discovered their affair, not an affair with Cooper, but with Jensen, the banker had to silence her. He'd used the storm as cover. He'd used the Coopers' known animosity toward Daniel as a distraction. He'd probably been the one to scare off the ranch hand, Silas, who must have seen something he wasn't supposed to see. And then he'd engineered the sale of Emma and her children, placing them in Daniel's home like a ticking time bomb. He'd assumed a grieving widow and 5 starving children would be the final straw, the thing that would finally break Daniel Holt and make him sell the land for pennies. Jensen hadn't sold them to Daniel to help the rancher. He'd done it to destroy him. Just as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Emma's mind, the sky outside turned a bruised, ugly purple. The wind began to howl, and the first snowflakes, hard and sharp as bits of glass, began to fly. The blizzard Daniel had been predicting had arrived, and in the middle of it, the cabin door flew open. It was Mary, her face sheet-white with terror, snow melting in her hair. "Mama!" she gasped, pointing out into the swirling white chaos. "The twins! I can't find them. They said they saw men with lanterns up by the oak tree, by Mrs. Holt's grave. They went to see who it was." The blood drained from Emma's face. Jensen and the Coopers. They were out there, in the storm, digging for their gold, and Elizabeth and Robert had walked right into their path. The blizzard was a roaring white monster, trying to swallow them whole. Visibility was non-existent. The world had been reduced to a screaming, swirling vortex of snow and ice. Emma could barely see Daniel, a dark shape moving just a few feet ahead of her, the rope tied between their waists, the only thing keeping them from being separated and lost forever. "Elizabeth! Robert!" Their names were ripped from her throat by the wind, swallowed by the storm. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. But the thought of her children, alone and terrified in this frozen hell, was a fire in her belly. She would find them. She had to. It was Daniel who spotted the footprints, tiny indentations already filling with snow, leading away from the path toward the low hill where Alice's grave lay beneath the oak tree. They followed the faint trail, their hopes sinking with every step. A faint cry, almost lost in the howl of the wind, reached them. "Over here!" They found the twins huddled in the lee of the stone wall that bordered the small cemetery, shivering violently, their faces blue with cold. Elizabeth was barely conscious. "We saw them," Robert chattered, his teeth clacking together. "3 men. They had shovels. They were digging at the grave." "Did they see you?" Daniel asked, his voice grim, as he stripped off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around the 2 small children. "I don't think so," Robert whispered. "We got scared, and we ran. And then we got lost." "Fools!" Daniel growled. But his hands were gentle as he lifted Elizabeth into his arms. "Emma, you take Robert. We have to get them back to the house, now." The journey back was a nightmare. Each step was a battle against the wind, which seemed determined to rip them from the face of the earth. Elizabeth was a dead weight in Daniel's arms, her shivering having stopped, a terrifyingly bad sign. Emma half carried, half dragged Robert, whispering words of encouragement she couldn't bring herself to believe. Just when she thought her legs would give out, that they would all perish in the snow just yards from safety, the dark shape of the main house loomed out of the white chaos. Mary and Catherine threw the door open, their faces awash with relief and fear. They spent the rest of the night huddled around the fireplace, slowly, carefully warming the twins back to life. As the children finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, piled together under a mountain of blankets, Daniel turned to Emma, his face etched with a new, terrible understanding. "They weren't looking for gold," he said quietly. Emma knew he was right. Old Man Holt had been a canny, suspicious man. He wouldn't have left a map to a gold mine lying around, but he might have left something else, a secret known only to his son. "There's no gold," Daniel confirmed, his eyes dark with memory. "My father was a water witcher. He found water where no one else could. Before he died, he told me he'd found a deep aquifer on this land, a spring that never runs dry, even in the worst drought. In a land ravaged by 3 years of drought, a source of endless fresh water wasn't just valuable. It was priceless. It was worth more than any gold mine. It was the key to controlling the entire valley." "Alice knew," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with a pain that was more than just grief. "I told her. It was the one secret I ever shared with her, and she had shared it with Jensen. That was what the banker was after, and he was willing to desecrate a grave, to kill, to destroy a family to get it." The storm raged for 2 more days, trapping them in the house, a small island of warmth in a sea of frozen fury. It gave them time to think, time to plan. Emma retrieved Alice's diary from the cabin, and together, she and Daniel and Mary pored over its pages, looking for anything they might have missed. It was Mary who noticed it. In some of the later entries, Alice had used strange phrases, capitalizing words that shouldn't have been. "The sun rises over the ridge," or "I must follow the water to the end of the line." "It's a code," Mary breathed, her eyes bright with excitement. "Look, if you take the first letter of each capitalized word." Working together, they deciphered the hidden message woven through Alice's final, desperate weeks. It wasn't a map. It was a confession, and a warning. "Jensen is mad. He demands the location of the spring. I told him I do not know. He does not believe me. He threatened Daniel. He said he will use the Coopers to start a fight, to have Daniel killed. He says I must run with him, or he will destroy us all. I am not afraid of Daniel. I am afraid of him." Alice hadn't been running from her husband. She'd been running from her lover. She had been trying to protect Daniel. In the diary's final coded message, she revealed the truth of that terrible night. "Jensen is coming. He is taking me away. I will not go. The spring is safe. Under the heart." "Under the heart," Emma murmured, looking at Daniel. A look of dawning comprehension spread across his face. He stood up and walked to the stone fireplace, the heart of the home. He reached up and felt along the rough wooden mantelpiece, a piece of timber he'd carved himself in the first year of his marriage. His fingers found a small, almost invisible notch. He pressed it. A section of the mantelpiece swung open, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was not a map, but a single, folded sheet of paper. It was the official deed to the underground water rights for the entire Broken Horn Ranch, registered by Daniel's father with the territorial office 30 years ago. It was ironclad legal proof that the spring belonged to the Holt family. Alice hadn't led Jensen to the spring. She had protected it. She had hidden the one thing that could save the ranch, the one thing that could prove Daniel's ownership. She had hidden it right under Jensen's nose. The storm broke on the fourth morning, revealing a world blanketed in pristine, silent white. They knew Jensen and the Coopers would be back. They would be angry and desperate. They couldn't go to the law in Whitetail. The sheriff was a weak man who did whatever Jensen told him to. They were on their own. "We can't fight them," Emma said, looking at her children. "Not with guns." "No," Daniel agreed, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face for the first time. "We won't fight them. We'll trap them. We'll use their own greed as the bait." Their plan was simple, and it was brilliant. They would give Jensen and the Coopers exactly what they were looking for. Daniel, using his memory of the land, drew a fake map. It was a work of art, aged with coffee grounds and singed at the edges. It didn't lead to the spring. It led to the old, abandoned silver mine at the farthest, most unstable edge of his property, a place known for cave-ins and treacherous shafts. He marked a spot deep inside the most dangerous tunnel. "The mother lode," he wrote, next to a large X. The next challenge was getting the map into the Coopers' hands without them suspecting a thing. That task fell to Robert. He was small, he was quick, and he was a surprisingly good actor. 2 days later, Daniel and Emma sent Robert and Mary into town for supplies, a calculated risk. As Mary kept the storekeeper busy, Robert, looking pale and frightened, accidentally dropped the folded map near the cracker barrel. He snatched it up quickly, looking around with wide, guilty eyes, and shoved it back in his pocket. The performance was perfect. Rufus Cooper's youngest brother, a hulking simpleton named Jeb, saw the whole thing. The secret map was now a tantalizing prize he believed he had discovered all on his own. They knew the Coopers would not be able to resist. They would come that very night. As twilight bled across the snow-covered landscape, Daniel and Emma put the rest of their plan into motion. They took the children, the deed to the water rights, and Charles's rifle, and they left the ranch. They didn't hide in the barn or the root cellar. They rode 3 miles west, to the one place Jensen would never think to look, the homestead of their nearest neighbor, a crusty old rancher named Henderson, who despised the Cooper brothers and had a long-standing grudge against the bank. They laid the whole story out for him. Henderson listened, his weathered face impassive, then spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Always knew Jensen was a snake," he grunted. "And the Coopers are vermin. What do you need?" "A witness," Daniel said, "and 1 fast horse." That night, as a full moon rose over the valley, 4 dark figures on horseback approached the Broken Horn Ranch. Jensen and the 3 Cooper brothers, armed with shovels, picks, and pistols, were ready to claim their prize. They found the house and cabin dark and silent. The family apparently fled in terror. Smirking in triumph, they followed the fake map to the entrance of the abandoned silver mine. They lit their lanterns and plunged into the darkness, their minds full of the riches that awaited them. They didn't know they were being watched. From a high ridge overlooking the mine, Daniel and Henderson lay flat in the snow, rifles ready. And thundering down the main road from the next county over was Mary, riding Henderson's fastest horse like the wind, sent on the most important errand of her life, to fetch Circuit Judge Morrison, a famously incorruptible lawman who was known to be wintering in the town of Cold Creek. Deep inside the mine, Jensen and the Coopers found the tunnel marked on the map. They began to dig frantically at the spot marked with an X, their greed making them careless. They didn't notice the carefully placed support beam that Daniel had sawed almost completely through earlier that day. They didn't hear the ominous creak of shifting rock above them. On the ridge, Daniel gave Henderson a nod. He lifted his rifle, took careful aim, and fired. The shot wasn't aimed at the men. It was aimed at a large, precariously balanced boulder at the lip of the mine entrance. The bullet struck sparks off the rock. The vibrations did the rest. With a deep, groaning roar, the entrance to the silver mine collapsed, sealing Jensen and the Coopers inside in a cloud of dust and darkness. It wasn't a fatal rock slide, but it was big enough to trap them. They were caught, like rats in a trap. By dawn, the mine was surrounded. Judge Morrison had arrived, along with the terrified, stammering whitetail sheriff he'd collected on the way. Trapped, with no way out, their conspiracy crumbled. The youngest Cooper, Jeb, broke first, screaming out a full confession in exchange for rescue, implicating his brothers and, most importantly, Jensen. He told them everything. The plan to get the water rights, the fake affair with Rufus, and the truth about Alice's death. Jensen hadn't meant to kill her. He'd gone to the grave that night to try and force her to tell him where the real map was. She'd refused, and they'd argued. He'd pushed her, and she had fallen, striking her head on a frozen stone marker. He'd left her there, in the storm, to die. It wasn't murder, perhaps, but it was a crime just as dark. Justice, when it came, was swift. The Coopers were sent to prison for conspiracy and attempted theft, and Mr. Jensen, the respectable banker, was charged with manslaughter, his life of lies and greed ending in a dark, cold mine shaft. The town of Whitetail looked at the Sullivan family differently after that. They were no longer the Bott family, the objects of pity and scorn. They were heroes. Daniel Holt, his name finally cleared, did two things. First, he went to the county clerk and filed for the official adoption of Mary, Catherine, Elizabeth, Robert, and Thomas. They were no longer Sullivans. They were Holts. Second, he drew up a new deed to the Broken Horn Ranch. It listed 7 owners, in equal shares: Daniel, Emma, and each of the 5 children. The land belonged to all of them. That spring, as the last of the snow melted and green life returned to the valley, he found Emma on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. In his hand was a small, intricately carved wooden box. "I made this for you," he said, his voice soft. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a piece of velvet, was a simple silver ring. "Emma," he began, his stormy eyes full of a light she'd never seen before. "I once told you I wasn't looking for a wife. I was a fool. I was a man hiding from life. You and the children. You didn't just save my ranch. You saved me." He knelt down on the porch, his limp barely noticeable, a strong, whole man. "Will you and the children do me the honor," he asked, his voice thick with emotion, "of being my family?" Emma looked at the man before her. She looked at the children laughing in the sun, their faces full of joy. She thought of the cold, desperate woman who had stood on an auction block, a for sale sign around her neck. They had come to this place as property. They had survived as workers, but they had become a family. "Yes," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes, Daniel, we will." That evening, they all gathered around the big kitchen table. Daniel raised his cup of cider. "To second chances," he said, his eyes finding Emma's. Emma smiled, her heart full. "And to knowing," she added, her gaze sweeping over her children, her family, "that your worth is never measured by what someone will pay for you, but by the love you are brave enough to build. If you believe a family is something you build, not something you buy, and that everyone deserves a second chance, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one."